how that might affect what's going on here in Virginia. Basically, this conference today, make sure I'm going to change this.
Go forward?
Yep. Easy enough. You're going to hear a lot of discussions from different folks today in these particular areas about economic development opportunities because of wind, the local community in wind, Virginia-specific issues such as the regulatory approval process, etc., Pennsylvania Model Wind Ordinance, wind and wildlife, a discussion of the wind and wildlife issues, and advocacy, real important part, advocacy and messaging for wind. My particular discussion is going to be, my particular discussion is going to be an overview of the history of the wind in the Mid-Atlantic region. I'm going to discuss current issues, the current status of wind in the Mid-Atlantic region. I'm going to talk about why wind, which is really the whole point of my discussion. What are the benefits of wind, and why we should be doing this, why we should be developing wind in Virginia and elsewhere in this country, Mid-Atlantic region especially, at least from my perspective. And how do we get there? How does wind get to achieve its piece of the pie? Because that's really important. And I'll talk about that through my discussion. I'll give you a little commercial on the Mid-Atlantic Renewable Energy Coalition, what we do, and who some of our members are, and then I'll be available for questions after that. Just to start off with a little information on what's going on around the country with wind, where wind stands today, and I thank my friends from AWEA for providing this information. One of the things you really should do is go up to the AWEA website, because AWEA has a fact sheet on every state in the country. It has a fact sheet on federal issues, any issue you can think about in the wind area. AWEA has that information. It has a lot of other important information that should be helpful in your review of wind issues. So some of the facts. There are 29 states, including the District, and also the District of Columbia, that have renewable portfolio standards. And these are basically requirements for the electric utilities to purchase a portion of their supply, and they have to be, generally speaking, clean, renewable energy. And that has to be sold to their customers. I'll get into that in more detail a little bit later. There's over 5,000 megawatts of wind that was added in the year 2010. That's somewhat down from 2009, where there was about 10,000 megawatts that was added that year. That relates a lot to, I think, the downturn in the economy, because this next year is looking a lot better, and so we think things are going to improve over the next few years. The total installed capacity of wind is over 40,000 megawatts now, and that's a pretty big achievement to this point, but it only represents about 2% of the supply that's generated in this country. So there's a long way to go, and I'll talk about where we need to go in this discussion. There's 5,600 megawatts under construction. This is the reason why I think wind is going to really pick up this year. We already have 5,600 megawatts under construction at the very start of 2011. And important fact, and a real important fact to a lot of folks, especially when you talk to people in the legislatures of the states in the region, Virginia, I'm sure, is very concerned. It creates jobs, and there's 85,000 jobs at this point that are being supported by the wind industry, direct and indirect jobs. Here's an interesting slide. Now my focus is going to turn to the Mid-Atlantic region, and just going to give you an idea of how basically new the Mid-Atlantic region is to wind, and we're really in the infancy stages of wind development in this area, in this region. So if you look at a state like, let's take Pennsylvania is probably the best example. And they had less than a megawatt in 1999, presumably a single turbine maybe at that point. In 2000, which is not listed on this chart, they had 11 megawatts, and that was it for the whole Mid-Atlantic region. Now, by 2005, which is only 6 years ago, there was still only 203 megawatts of wind in the Mid-Atlantic region, or at least these states in the Mid-Atlantic region. By 2010, you can see that the game has changed quite a bit, and now we're up to 1,259, and certainly growing. We certainly are seeing, and you'll see on my next slide why I'm saying that, but basically 2005, very, very early stages, but by 2010, wind is starting to pick up in this region. And you'll notice that Virginia's sitting there with 0, and we'll talk about that a little bit as well. Next slide. Okay, under construction at the end of 2010, basically Delaware, New Jersey did not have any under construction, but Maryland had 50. On the previous slide, they had 70 actually installed, and that was last year. That was their first wind farm. Pennsylvania, 159, so it's still growing. They should be past 1,000 megawatts at the end of this year. There are other developments out there that are going to go under construction, and the numbers, this 159 is actually just reflective of the beginning of the year. So that will rise, and we'll hopefully see over 1,000 megawatts in Pennsylvania. Virginia has 38 megawatts under construction, but my understanding is that's at the very early stages, and I'm not sure how far off the ground that particular project is at this point. West Virginia, another very successful state to this point, has 92 megawatts under construction. The next column, which is really, I think, an interesting column because it looks like an awful lot of wind. There's something called the PJM-Q, which is basically where projects are projected. A developer goes to PJM, which is the planning entity, and they basically operate the transmission grid in this Mid-Atlantic region and some parts of the Midwest. It's the biggest, PJM is the biggest, what they call an RTO, Regional Transmission Organization in the country. And they have something called the queue, which is basically where I have a project, I basically provide an application or information to PJM, and that project gets put into the PJM queue, but it has to go through studies and different analyses by PJM, and oftentimes these projects don't make it for various reasons. But it's important to see that there are a lot of projects there, and definitely some of these, and maybe a lot of these, will be built at some point in time. May not be this year or next year. It might be 5-7 years down.
Bruce, do any of those megawatts in the queue reflect offshore projects?
Yes, these all reflect offshore projects. For instance, Virginia has a 500 megawatt offshore project. So the number, it's a 500 megawatt one. So that number is reflected in the Virginia queue. I can tell you that Delaware is not going to have, I'm from Delaware, so Delaware is not going to have 450 megawatts onshore wind. That's a project that I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. It's an offshore project that is actually very possible to get done, possible that it will get done, which is in the offshore wind industry. Since we don't have any of such facilities right now, that's going to be a big step. Delaware. What's really important are these RPS standards. I feel it's very important that the states have mandatory RPS standards. And in Delaware, they have probably the most aggressive RPS standards. Now, realize they're not building onshore wind in Delaware, so they either have to get it from out of state or they have to get it from offshore wind in Delaware. And I know Delaware very much wants to do a lot of offshore wind if they can, The project in the queue we just talked about, 450 megawatts, it's one project. There's actually a signed purchase power agreement in Delaware. It was the first signed purchase power agreement for offshore wind in the country. And that's for 200 megawatts of offshore wind. But the Blue Water Wind folks, who are the developers, want to build it at 450 megawatts. So that's why 450 is in the PJM queue. The major electric utility in Delaware is actually purchasing onshore wind from both the new project in Maryland and a project in Pennsylvania. Next. Maryland Wind Power, another very aggressive RPS standard, 20% Tier 1, which is where wind is located in their RPS. I should point out that there's a solar carve-out, so that's important because 2% solar carve-out means that it's really there's only a chance for wind to have 18% of that amount. So the 2% actually is a reduction because you have to do the 2%. It's not a choice, and that counts against the 20%. So it's very important to know that these solar carve-outs, what happens, it's not just solar. In a lot of states they have some really crazy carve-outs. Every time there's a carve-out, or another type of renewable or alternative energy, which could be clean coal, nuclear in some states, whatever, that will count against the 20%, and it will reduce the amount of wind and other renewables that would normally be counted in the Tier 1. So that's something you have to guard against in states, and we're doing this, for instance, in Pennsylvania, in states where they're definitely looking to reduce the amount of, or to add carve-outs which really don't apply to the Tier 1 grouping. We'll talk about what's installed and under construction in Maryland. Maryland's an interesting state. They just had a lot of discussion. A bill was being considered in Maryland for offshore wind. It was a bill that would require 400 to 600 megawatts of offshore wind. The legislation was tabled, and the reason why it was tabled is that they wanted more discussion. I sat through the proceedings at both the House and Senate in Maryland, and it was clear that they were very concerned about the impacts on ratepayers, the added costs to ratepayers of offshore wind. So they tabled it. They're working on potentially rate caps so that in the event that the rates go up dramatically because of this, the Public Service Commission, in Maryland that would look at this would have the ability to say we're not doing that project because the rates would go up too high. We can't do that project because it's statutorily capped at a certain amount of increase. New Jersey. New Jersey actually passed their offshore wind. First of all, let me start with they have a very aggressive RPS requirement. I couldn't tell you what that amounts to as a percentage, but the 5,000, they just changed their law to 5,316 gigawatt hours of solar carve-out. Presumably it's well above the 2.12% that is needed by 2021. I'm assuming it's at least 3 or 4% solar carve-out. So again, that's going to count against the wind amounts, and actually the offshore wind, since it's 1,100 megawatts, which is a pretty good chunk, is also going to count against onshore wind purchases as far as the RPS is concerned. Another important part about New Jersey is that every 3 or 4 or 5 years they do a New Jersey Energy Master Plan, and that's at this very moment being updated and reviewed, and my organization is going to be part of that process. We certainly support the offshore wind direction that the state is going, but we also want to make sure that they don't want to lose sight of onshore wind, which is very important. Not that they're going to build a lot of onshore wind in New Jersey, but they can certainly purchase it from other states. Pennsylvania.